Picture this, it's early January 1066, and the most powerful kingdom in northern Europe is suddenly leaderless. King Edward the Confessor, the man who had ruled England for over 2 decades, has just drawn his last breath, leaving behind something far more dangerous than grief. He left behind an empty throne. And in the medieval world, an empty throne wasn't just a political problem. It was an open invitation for war. England in 1066 was one of the wealthiest, most organized kingdoms in the known world. Its farmlands were rich, its trade routes were profitable, and its people were accustomed to a certain kind of order. But that order rested entirely on one thing, a king. Without one, everything, the laws, the taxes, the armies, the very fabric of society, began to shake. 3 men across Europe looked at that empty throne and each thought the same thing: it belongs to me. The man who grabbed the crown first. The fastest hand in the room belonged to Harold Godwinson. By most accounts, he was the most powerful nobleman in England, the Earl of Wessex, a man who had spent years essentially running the kingdom while Edward grew older and weaker. Harold was English through and through. He understood the land, the people, and the politics. When Edward died on January 5, Harold didn't waste a single day. Within 24 hours of Edward's death, Harold had himself crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. It was a bold move, some would call it audacious, others would call it desperate. Harold claimed that Edward had whispered his name on his deathbed, granting him the kingdom as a final gift. Whether that's true or a convenient story, nobody can say for certain. But Harold had one massive advantage over every other claimant: he was already there, on English soil, with the support of the Witan, England's Council of Nobles, behind him. For a moment, it looked like it might actually work. The Norman who never forgot a promise. Across the English Channel, in the region of Normandy in what is now northern France, a man named William received the news of Harold's coronation and reportedly went very, very quiet. That silence was far more frightening than any outburst. William, Duke of Normandy, was not a man who took betrayal lightly, and in his mind, what Harold had done was the deepest kind of betrayal imaginable. Here's why: a few years earlier, around 1064, Harold Godwinson had found himself shipwrecked on the coast of Normandy. William had taken him in, treated him as an honored guest, and according to Norman sources, made Harold swear a sacred oath on holy relics. That oath, William insisted, was a promise that Harold would support William's claim to the English throne. Whether Harold made that oath willingly or under pressure, whether he truly meant it or said whatever he needed to say to get home safely, these are questions historians still argue about today. But from William's perspective, the answer didn't matter. A sacred oath had been made. Harold had broken it. And William, a man who had clawed his way from illegitimate birth to become the most feared ruler in northern France, was not about to let that go. William had his own claim to the English throne through blood. He was a distant cousin of Edward the Confessor, and he maintained that Edward had personally promised him the crown years before Harold ever entered the picture. With Harold's coronation, William saw not just a political rival, he saw a thief sitting on his throne. Building an army across the Channel. What happened next is one of the most remarkable military mobilizations in medieval history. William didn't just gather a few knights and sail across the Channel in a fit of rage. He planned. He organized. He convinced. First, he needed the blessing of the Catholic Church. Pope Alexander II, after hearing William's case, including the story of Harold's broken oath, gave William a papal banner and his official endorsement. In 1066, that was enormous. It meant William wasn't just fighting a political war, he was fighting a righteous one. Soldiers who fought under the papal banner believed they had God on their side. Then William began recruiting. Knights, infantry, archers, and adventurers poured in from across Normandy and beyond, from Brittany, Flanders, and other parts of France. These men came for different reasons. Some were loyal to William personally. Some were motivated by faith. Many, if we're being honest, were motivated by the promise of land and riches in England if the invasion succeeded. William was essentially offering his soldiers a share of an entire kingdom. That's a compelling recruitment pitch. By the summer of 1066, William had assembled a force estimated between 7,000 and 12,000 men, including cavalry, archers, and infantry, along with hundreds of ships to carry them across the Channel. It was an invasion force the likes of which England had never faced. Harold's nightmare, war on two fronts. While William was preparing in Normandy, Harold was already dealing with a crisis he hadn't anticipated. Another man had entered the contest for England's crown, Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, one of the most feared warriors in all of Scandinavia. Hardrada also believed he had a legitimate claim to the English throne through a complicated series of agreements between previous Scandinavian and English rulers. In September 1066, Hardrada invaded from the north, sailing up the river Humber with a massive fleet, joined by Harold's own treacherous brother, Tostig. Harold was forced to march his army at incredible speed northward, covering nearly 200 miles in just 4 days. On September 25, 1066, he caught the Norwegian army completely off guard at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, near York. It was a decisive English victory. Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian threat was finished. Harold had every right to feel proud. He had just pulled off one of the great military victories of the era. But there was no time to celebrate. Just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, on September 28, William and his Norman army landed on the southern coast of England at Pevensey Bay. Harold received the news and faced an agonizing decision: rest his exhausted army and wait, or march south immediately and meet the threat before William could consolidate his position. Harold chose speed. It would prove to be a fateful choice. Two men on a collision course. By mid-October 1066, the two armies were converging on a patch of ground near the town of Hastings in East Sussex. Harold moved fast, perhaps too fast, pushing his tired men southward without giving them adequate time to recover from Stamford Bridge. His commanders urged him to wait, to rest, to gather more forces. Harold refused, or felt he couldn't afford to. William, meanwhile, had spent the weeks since landing systematically raiding and burning the English countryside around Hastings. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated strategy. William knew that Harold had deep personal ties to this region. It was his own earldom, his home territory, his people being burned and displaced. William was baiting Harold, provoking him into a hasty confrontation rather than a careful, well-prepared defense. It was working. On the evening of October 13, 1066, Harold positioned his army on a ridge called Senlac Hill, just outside Hastings. He chose his ground carefully. The high position would make it difficult for Norman cavalry to charge uphill effectively. His men, exhausted but disciplined, formed their famous shield wall, a nearly impenetrable line of overlapping shields stretching across the ridge, bristling with axes and spears. Below the hill, in the fading light of that October evening, William looked up at the English position and made his own preparations. He arranged his forces into 3 divisions, infantry, archers, and cavalry, and readied himself for what he fully understood was the most important day of his life. 2 kings. 1 crown. And tomorrow, everything would be decided. The morning of October 14, 1066 broke cold and grey over the English countryside. Mist still clung to the valleys of East Sussex as 2 armies stirred awake, ate whatever food they had, said whatever prayers they believed in, and prepared themselves for something they all understood on a deep, instinctive level, that before this day ended, thousands of them would be dead. The ridge at Senlac Hill was about to become the most consequential piece of ground in English history. And for the men standing on it, and below it, there was nowhere left to go but forward. Harold Godwinson stood atop that ridge with somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 men. His army was a formidable force on paper, experienced, battle-hardened, and fresh off a stunning victory at Stamford Bridge just 19 days earlier. But fresh is the wrong word. These men were exhausted. They had marched nearly 400 miles in under 3 weeks, fought a major battle, and then turned around and marched south again without adequate rest. Many of Harold's best fighters, his elite Huscarls, professional soldiers equipped with deadly two-handed axes and chainmail, were present and ready. But a significant portion of his force was made up of FYRD, the English citizen militia, farmers and tradesmen who had answered the call to arms. They were brave. They were motivated. But they were not the same caliber as the Norman knights waiting below. The shield wall, England's greatest defense. Harold's battle plan was straightforward and smart given his circumstances. He ordered his men into the shield wall, a tightly packed formation stretching roughly 600 to 700 yards across the top of Senlac Ridge. Each man locked his shield with the man beside him, creating an almost solid barrier of wood and iron. Behind the front rank, men stood ready to step in the moment anyone fell. It was a proven formation, one that had served English armies well for generations. On high ground, against cavalry charges, it was genuinely difficult to break. Harold's orders were equally straightforward: hold the line. Don't chase. Don't break formation. Stand firm, absorb the Norman attacks, and let the terrain do the work. If William's army couldn't crack the shield wall by nightfall, the Normans, far from home, in hostile territory, without local supply lines, would be in serious trouble. Time, Harold believed, was on his side. It was a reasonable plan. It almost worked. William's three-part war machine. Down the slope, William of Normandy was arranging his forces with the precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life making war. He divided his army into 3 divisions, each containing a mix of infantry, archers, and cavalry, a layered, flexible fighting force designed to attack in waves and adapt to whatever the English threw at them. The plan was sequential and brutal in its logic. First, the archers would advance and rain arrows down on the English shield wall, forcing men to raise their shields and disrupting the tight formation. Then the infantry would move in close, engaging the shield wall in brutal hand-to-hand combat, wearing down the English physically and psychologically. Finally, when gaps appeared and the English line began to weaken, the Norman cavalry, the heavy warhorses carrying armored knights, would punch through those gaps and shatter whatever remained. On paper, it was a masterful combined arms strategy. In practice, the morning would prove far more complicated than any battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. The first hours, Norman frustration. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, the battle began. Norman archers advanced to within range and let loose their first volleys. The English shield wall absorbed the arrows with remarkable effectiveness, the overlapping shields deflected most of the projectiles, and the high ground meant many arrows simply fell short or embedded harmlessly in wood and leather. The initial archery assault accomplished far less than William had hoped. Then the Norman infantry moved up the slope. And here is where the battle turned into something genuinely horrifying for the Normans. Charging uphill into a disciplined shield wall is one of the most physically punishing things a medieval soldier can do. The English Huscarls were waiting with their massive two-handed axes, weapons capable of cutting through a horse's neck or splitting a man's helmet with a single blow. Norman soldiers who reached the shield wall found themselves hacking against a barrier that seemed almost alive, constantly reforming, constantly pushing back. The hours between roughly 9 a.m. and midday were a nightmare for William's forces. Wave after wave of Norman infantry crashed against the English line and recoiled. The cavalry charged, found no gaps to exploit, and pulled back. English axes rose and fell in a rhythm that must have seemed almost mechanical to those watching from a distance, devastating, relentless, exhausting. At some point during these early assaults, a rumor swept through the Norman ranks like wildfire: William is dead. The Duke had been unhorsed, his horse killed beneath him, and in the chaos of battle, men who couldn't see him assumed the worst. The Norman left flank began to break. Soldiers who moments before had been attacking turned and ran. The moment that changed everything. What happened next is the pivot point of the entire battle, possibly the pivot point of English history. A portion of the English FYRD on Harold's right flank did something that Harold had explicitly ordered them not to do: they broke formation and chased the retreating Normans down the hill. Whether it was excitement, bloodlust, inexperience, or simply the irresistible human instinct to pursue a fleeing enemy, they broke the shield wall and gave chase. William, very much alive, tore off his helmet and rode along his lines, showing his face, screaming that he lived. The Norman retreat stopped. And then, with cold, lethal efficiency, William's cavalry turned on the pursuing English soldiers who were now isolated, downhill, out of formation, and completely vulnerable. The English who had broken ranks were cut down almost to the last man. It was a catastrophic mistake. A chunk of Harold's right flank was simply gone. The shield wall, which had been nearly unbreakable when intact, now had a wound in its side. And William, watching from below, understood exactly what had just happened. The afternoon, a battle of attrition. The fighting continued through the afternoon with savage intensity. William, now understanding the problem with the shield wall, began adapting his tactics. His archers were ordered to change their angle. Instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, they began firing in high arcs, letting the arrows fall down onto the English from above, where shields provided less protection. Men began falling from above rather than in front. The psychological effect alone was significant. William's cavalry began executing what some historians believe were deliberate feigned retreats, pulling back to draw more English soldiers out of formation, then turning and destroying them in the open. Whether these were planned tactics or improvised responses to the chaos of battle remains debated, but the effect was real. The English line was shrinking. The gaps were growing. Harold's Huscarls, his professional corps, fought with extraordinary discipline and courage throughout the afternoon. These were men who understood that retreat was not an option, that their king stood behind them, that England itself stood behind them. They died in place, closing gaps with their bodies, refusing to yield ground they had sworn to hold. But they were running out of men. And the afternoon was running out of light. The death of a king. As the October sun began its descent toward the horizon, somewhere around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, the Norman archers loosed another volley into the increasingly thin English line. What happened next has been debated by historians for nearly 1,000 years, immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, and argued over in academic journals across the world. Harold Godwinson was struck. The most famous version of the story, the image burned into popular imagination, is an arrow through the eye. The Bayeux Tapestry, embroidered within decades of the battle, appears to show exactly this. Some historians dispute it, arguing the tapestry has been misread, that Harold may have been cut down by Norman cavalry instead. The truth, at this distance of nearly 10 centuries, may never be fully known. What is known is this: Harold fell. And when the king fell, the English army, which had fought with incredible determination for nearly 8 straight hours, finally broke. The Huscarls who remained standing made their last stand around Harold's body, refusing to run, dying where they stood in a final act of loyalty that even the Normans reportedly acknowledged with a kind of grim respect. The rest of the English army dissolved into the darkening woods of the Sussex countryside. Norman cavalry pursued them, cutting down fleeing soldiers in a pursuit that lasted well into the night. The silence after. When the killing finally stopped and the October darkness settled over Senlac Hill, William of Normandy walked across a battlefield covered in thousands of dead. Among them, somewhere in that terrible landscape of broken shields and fallen axes, lay Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. The battle had lasted approximately 9 hours. It had been decided by exhaustion, by tactical adaptation, by a handful of English soldiers who broke ranks at exactly the wrong moment, and possibly by a single arrow finding its mark in the fading light of an autumn afternoon. England had a new master. And the world he was about to build would reshape everything: the language, the culture, the laws, and the very identity of a nation. The morning after the Battle of Hastings, England woke up to silence. Not the peaceful kind, the hollow, stunned silence that follows catastrophe. The fields around Senlac Hill were covered in the dead. The Anglo-Saxon army that had defended England for generations was shattered. Its king was gone. And somewhere in the Norman camp, a duke from northern France was already thinking about what came next. What came next would turn out to be one of the most radical transformations any nation has ever experienced in recorded history. The Battle of Hastings wasn't just a military victory. It was the opening act of a total cultural revolution, one that would remake England from the ground up, touching everything from the words people spoke to the food they ate, from the laws that governed them to the castles that dominated their skylines. And remarkably, the ripple effects of that single October day in 1066 are still visible in the world Americans live in today, in your courtrooms, your vocabulary, your government, and your culture, whether you realize it or not. The March to Power. William didn't declare himself King of England the morning after Hastings. He was too smart for that. He understood that a military victory and political legitimacy were two different things, and he needed both. Instead, he began a methodical, calculated march toward London, the heart of English power. Along the way, he continued his strategy of burning and raiding, not out of pure cruelty but as a deliberate demonstration of power. Every village that burned sent a message to the English nobility still debating what to do: resistance is costly. Some towns, understanding the new reality, simply surrendered and offered supplies. Others had to be persuaded more forcefully. The English nobles who survived Hastings scrambled desperately to organize resistance. They initially put forward Edgar Atheling, a young boy with royal blood, as a potential king. But without Harold's military force behind him, Edgar was more symbol than solution. The Norman army kept advancing. City after city fell or submitted. By December 1066, the English leadership, recognizing that further resistance would only bring more destruction, formally submitted to William at Berkhamsted. On Christmas Day, 1066, a date chosen with exquisite symbolic precision, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The very same church where Harold had been crowned less than a year before. The ceremony was conducted in both Latin and English, a deliberate gesture toward legitimacy. But when the assembled crowd outside the abbey roared their approval, the Norman guards surrounding the building panicked, thinking it was an uprising, and began setting fire to nearby buildings. Even the coronation of England's new king began with fire and confusion. It was, in retrospect, a fitting beginning. The Great Redistribution: who owns England now? The most immediate and devastating change William brought to England was the wholesale redistribution of land. In the years following Hastings, William systematically stripped the Anglo-Saxon nobility of virtually everything they owned. The numbers are staggering. Before 1066, the English nobility, the thanes and earls who had governed the country for generations, collectively owned the vast majority of English land. Within 20 years of Hastings, that same land was almost entirely in Norman hands. William parceled out English estates to the Norman lords and knights who had fought for him, creating an entirely new ruling class almost overnight. Of the roughly 180 major landowners in England by 1086, fewer than a dozen were English. The rest were Norman, Breton, or French. This wasn't just an economic transfer. It was the erasure of an entire social order. Anglo-Saxon England had its own complex aristocracy, its own traditions of governance, its own way of organizing society. William didn't reform that system. He replaced it. The old English lords either died at Hastings, fled into exile, or sank into obscurity. Their children grew up in a country that no longer had a place for them at the top. To solidify this new order, William ordered the construction of castles across England on a scale the country had never seen. The Norman castle, that iconic image of stone towers and battlements, was essentially foreign to England before 1066. The Anglo-Saxons had their own fortifications, but nothing like the imposing stone structures the Normans began building almost immediately after the conquest. These castles served a dual purpose: they were military strongholds that could crush any local rebellion, and they were powerful psychological statements, looming over English towns and villages as permanent reminders of who was in charge. The Tower of London, begun by William himself around 1078, still stands today. When you look at it, you're looking at a monument to conquest. The language revolution: how French became English. Here is where the story of 1066 gets truly remarkable. and where it connects most directly to every American reading these words right now. Before the Norman Conquest, the people of England spoke Old English, a Germanic language that would be almost completely unrecognizable to a modern reader. Words like signing, for king, laugh, for bread, folk, for people. It was a beautiful, complex language, but it was unmistakably Germanic in its roots, far closer to modern German or Dutch than to what we speak today. After 1066, the Norman ruling class brought their own language, Old French. And because the Normans controlled everything, the government, the courts, the church, the military, the aristocracy, their language came with them into every important domain of English life. What followed over the next 2 to 3 centuries was one of the most extraordinary linguistic collisions in human history. The common English people kept speaking their Germanic tongue. The Norman rulers spoke French. And gradually, inevitably, the two languages began to blend into something entirely new, what we now call Middle English, and eventually, Modern English. This collision is why the English language today is so uniquely rich, and so notoriously complicated. We have 2 words for almost everything, one from the Old Germanic English and one from the Norman French, and they carry different connotations to this day. Think about it, we say, cow, in the field, Old English, but beef, on the plate, Norman French. Sheep, grazes on the farm, Old English, but becomes mutton, at dinner, Norman French. We have freedom, Old English, and liberty, Norman French. Kingly, Old English, and royal, Norman French. Holy, and sacred. Ask and question. Begin and commence. Every single one of those word pairs traces directly back to 1066. The farmers who tended the animals spoke Old English. The Norman lords who ate the meat at their feasting tables spoke French. And both words survived, carrying their history inside them like DNA. American English, the language you're reading right now, is the direct descendant of this linguistic merger. Every time an American lawyer says attorney instead of lawyer, uses the word justice, talks about parliament, or orders beef at a steakhouse, they are speaking words that came to England on Norman ships in 1066. The Battle of Hastings didn't just change England. It built the foundation of the language that would eventually cross the Atlantic and become the most widely spoken tongue on earth. The legal revolution, Norman roots of American justice. The transformation went deeper than language. William's conquest fundamentally restructured the English legal and governmental system in ways that would echo directly into the American founding nearly 7 centuries later. William introduced the feudal system to England in a far more organized and centralized form than anything that had existed before. Every piece of land in England was now theoretically held from the king, lords held land from the king, knights held land from lords, and everyone owed military service up the chain. To understand exactly what he now owned, William commissioned the Domesday Book in 1086, an extraordinary survey of virtually every piece of land, livestock, and taxable resource in England. It was, in essence, the first national census in European history, a breathtaking act of administrative ambition that demonstrated exactly how completely William intended to control his new kingdom. The legal concepts that Norman England developed and refined, common law, trial processes, the rights of property, became the bedrock of the English legal tradition. That legal tradition crossed the Atlantic with the English colonists. The American legal system, with its common law foundations, its property rights, its courtroom procedures, its fundamental assumption that law applies equally to everyone including the powerful, all of it traces a direct line back through English legal history to the reforms and structures that emerged from the Norman Conquest. When the American founding fathers sat down to write the Constitution, they were consciously drawing on English legal and political traditions that had been shaped, generation by generation, by the aftermath of 1066. The conquest that Harold Godwinson died fighting against ultimately produced the legal DNA of the republic that would become the most powerful nation in history. What was lost, and what was gained? It would be dishonest to tell this story only as triumph. The Norman Conquest was, for ordinary English people, a brutal and often devastating experience. An entire native aristocracy was wiped out. A proud culture was suppressed. The English language itself was pushed to the margins of power for generations. Ordinary farmers and villagers found themselves under the authority of lords who didn't speak their language, didn't share their traditions, and often didn't particularly care about their welfare. The decades following Hastings saw uprisings, brutal suppressions, and enormous human suffering. The famous Harrying of the North, in 1069 and 1070, William's scorched earth campaign to crush northern English resistance, left entire regions depopulated and devastated. Contemporary chronicles describe villages abandoned, fields burned, and people starving in the hundreds of thousands. It was, by any modern standard, an atrocity. History is rarely clean. The same conquest that eventually produced the English language, common law, and ultimately the foundations of American democracy also produced immense suffering for the people who lived through it. Both things are true simultaneously, and honest history requires holding both. The Long Echo. Nearly 1,000 years have passed since William the Conqueror stood on Senlac Hill and watched England fall into his hands. The world he came from, of feudal lords, papal banners, and medieval cavalry charges, is so remote from our own that it can feel almost mythological. But the next time you use the word justice, order a stake, read a legal brief, or simply speak English to another person anywhere on earth, you are living inside the consequences of October 14, 1066. The battle lasted 9 hours. Its effects have lasted a millennium. One arrow, or one sword blow, historians still argue, ended Harold's reign atop Senlac Ridge. But it began something far larger, the long, complicated, painful, and ultimately extraordinary process of making the English-speaking world that Americans today inhabit. That's the real legacy of the Battle of Hastings. Not just a conquest. A creation.